This screencast is meant to introduce you to the 21st Century Learning Design activity rubrics. And these rubrics exist to help you to evaluate a lesson based on the 21st Century Learning Design framework, which is something that was created by Microsoft's Partners in Learning. The 21st Century Learning Design framework allows educators to evaluate whether or not learning activities are preparing students for 21st century learning and 21st century skills. It's this skills-based more than content-based. And we'll go through what the 6 different skills that this rubric explores are. And we're going to use an example of an actual lesson plan to learn about the rubric and to see how the rubric can be applied to assess a lesson. This is the lesson here. It's just a random one I picked off a website called Education World. It's a lesson designed for upper elementary and middle school, and it's on volcanoes. And so let me give you a description of the lesson, and I'll have links provided for you if you want to look at this stuff yourself. The lesson is really pretty straightforward, and it's something I would call a typical lesson that many teachers feel is technology-rich lesson. It starts with the teachers providing an overview of volcanoes, kind of direct instruction. Then the teacher explains that the kids will be making a PowerPoint of different parts of a volcano. So the teacher divides the students up into groups, assigns each student in the group a role. The 3 roles, I believe, are techie, note taker, and timekeeper. The techie's in charge of creating the PowerPoint slide. The note taker is the one who's apparently responsible for recording a lot of the research, and the timekeeper keeps an eye on the clock. So the students are divided up into these groups, and then they do web research to learn about the different parts of the volcano. The web research is all done on sites that are selected by the teacher. So the teacher has already vetted these sites as appropriate for the students to use. The students write down their notes and references on note cards, and then they turn the note cards into the teacher. The teacher checks through the note cards and then provides the note cards back to the students, and then the students then create their PowerPoint slide. Once the students are done creating the PowerPoint slide, the teacher collects all the slides and assembles them into a single PowerPoint that explains to the viewer of the PowerPoint the different parts of a volcano. So it's relatively straightforward as a lesson. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the 21st Century Learning Design rubrics to evaluate the quality of this lesson with regards to its ability to teach these so-called 21st century skills. So let me introduce to you what the 21st century skills being covered in this lesson are. The 6 rubrics cover the following 21st century skills: collaboration, knowledge construction, self-regulation, real-world problem-solving and innovation, use of ICT, which is information and communication technologies. In essence, it's just tech. That term, actually, ICT, is used a lot more in Europe than it is here, and skilled communication. And each one of these has a rubric associated with it. So we're going to use the rubric to score the lesson on these 6 areas. Now, note that this is just one way to assess a lesson. All we're looking at is whether or not the lesson emphasizes or helps to support the student's development of these skills. And not every lesson will or should score highly in each one of these areas. That would just be very difficult to do. Now, over the course of a major unit or over the course of a semester or a year, you'll want to spend some time in each one of these areas trying to support them if you believe that these skills are important for your students to develop. Just understand that it doesn't have to happen in every lesson. You can have some lessons that are really great in terms of supporting the student's development of these skills without each one of these skills being sort of a central part in each lesson. So we're not trying to get super high scores on every one of these for individual lessons, but if you take a group of lessons, we do want all of these areas to be hit. So let's go ahead and score this volcano lesson using this rubric, and I'll pop down into the first area, which is collaboration. Now, you'll see how this rubric works. We start here in the top left-hand corner. Here it's students are required to work in pairs or groups. If the answer is yes, then we move down to the next diamond here. If the answer is no, we move over to the side into the square, and there's a number associated with it. And as we're scoring this lesson quantitatively, that'll be the number we use for this particular section. So let's look at collaboration here. The first question to ask yourself about the lesson is pretty straightforward. Are the students required to work in pairs or groups? Yes, as I explained when I went through the lesson, the teacher divides the students up into groups. So we're going to go from this diamond to the next one. Now the next question, do students have shared responsibility? Depends on what you mean by shared responsibility. So let me move over to a different document from here. And this PDF was developed by Microsoft Partners in Learning. Again, they contracted to have this developed. I think it's very good, regardless of what you think of Microsoft products. This is a pretty good document here. What's funny about it is you read through the document, all of their examples, of course, use Microsoft products, but you can use this for anything. And this document, which is a longer PDF, it's 40-something pages, and this goes into more detail about each item on the rubric, and I'll make this PDF available to y'all as well. And so as I scroll through here, you'll see we can move to this major heading of collaboration, and this describes what this document views collaboration to be, and it defines each one of these ideas. So as I scroll through here, I'll go down to the shared responsibility page part of this section, and notice that it defines shared responsibility here, and it gives you examples to help you to score the rubric. Does one student own the work and the other is only helping in this? No, not really. It's actually students doing work together. This is a lab experiment, but at least the example is, but we can easily transfer that over. So we feel like this is probably, I would say, shared responsibility. So clicking back over here to the rubric, we're going to say yes here, and we're going to pop down to the next diamond. Do students make substantive decisions together? Well, let's pop back into the rubric and see what they mean by substantive decisions. And substantive decisions, their description, refers to students that make important decisions about the work together. Let's go down to these questions and see if this helps us. And already one thing that jumps out, do students assign roles? Are students assigned roles, or do they decide themselves who's going to do what? And notice here, the educator has planned the process of the work, not the students. The students haven't chosen what they're going to study. That was chosen by the teacher. The students really aren't making a lot of decisions in this lesson. So if we pop in here to the rubric, I'm going to say that no, students don't make substantive decisions together. So we're going to decide that this is a 3. So if you're writing this down or if you're trying to score this, we're going to start with collaboration, and we're going to score that as a 3. And then we move on to the next one. And the next rubric we have here is under the heading of knowledge construction. Now, if we go back into the PDF, which you would see it says about knowledge construction is it refers to a lot of the traits from Bloom's taxonomy, which you may have heard of, and the part of Bloom that it looks at is the upper parts of the taxonomy. We're talking about interpretation, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. This is more than just students learning a set of facts, but it's students constructing their own knowledge. Now, this bit is really hard to plan for, but you get a lot of your bang from your buck from this. So this is where we start to work on the students being independent thinkers and students really constructing knowledge, so it's not just some facts that they learn to pass the test at the end, but rather the knowledge that's a little stickier in their brain. Now, does this lesson require knowledge construction? Are students building their own knowledge through synthesis or through interpretation or through adaptation? And I think that's a pretty clear no. And if you went through the questions in the longer document associated with the rubric, you'd see that this pretty squarely falls into no. So we're going to go ahead and give this a 1 in knowledge construction. And again, that doesn't mean this is a bad lesson. It just means that this lesson doesn't work on that particular skill. You wouldn't want to have a whole unit full of lessons where all the knowledge construction in each individual lesson scores out as a 1. We wouldn't want that. But if an individual lesson here or there does, that's fine. But again, it's just not something that we want to do too much. Now let's move on to the next rubric, which we see as self-regulation. Now, by self-regulation, That refers to the student's ability to guide themselves, to take responsibility for their own learning. So in an ideal situation, if you see a learning environment where students are regulating themselves, it's one where the students are working through activities and learning because they really want to learn, and there's a reason why they're trying to learn a piece of information. It's in the service of something else. If the reason they're trying to learn it is because the teacher said so or because it's on the test, then that's not necessarily self-regulation. And the rubric bears that out. Notice the first one asks if the activity is long-term, and do the students have learning goals and success criteria defined for them in advance? That's the first step towards self-regulation. If the answer is yes, then we slide down to the next diamond. If the answer is no, again, then we're going to go ahead and score based on where we end up, which is going to be 1 here. Now, this is not a long-term activity. This is one where if we got back into the lesson, you'll see that the students are given pretty much more or less a class period to come up with this. This is kind of a one and done thing. So this is not a lesson where students would be able to develop self-regulation. Now, again, that's okay. But what we would want to see throughout an entire unit is maybe some more opportunities for students to develop their own self-regulation. We want students to be able to plan their own work. We want the students to be able to revise their own work based on feedback. It's an old saying among English teachers that revision is the soul of learning, and we need to be able to get there by having some longer-term activities where the students are more responsible for their own learning. So this is, again, a 1 on this lesson. Moving to the next one, problem solving. So it's a 21st century skill that, think in terms of the business world or the working world where people who are working on a particular project will run into problems, and they need to figure out how to solve those problems based on the tools they have. We need to provide these situations for students so they can develop their problem-solving skills before they enter the post-school world. So we go to this rubric and we ask ourselves, is the main requirement in the task problem-solving? For our volcano example, I think that's a no. There's really no problem to be solved. The students are just going out and collecting facts about volcanoes and putting them on PowerPoint slides. So we're going to score this one a 1 as well. Now you'll see as we move down through the diamonds, if we had answered yes, the next question would be, are students working on a real-world problem? And this is kind of an important point. Real-world problems involve real situations that exist outside of school. They involve data that is collected from outside of school. It provides some context for a lesson that's going to end up making the learning more contextualized, which in turn will have the learning be more meaningful for the students. So we want to try it eventually, as we move down through these, developing our 21st century skills in our lessons, we want to sort of focus, if we can, on real-world problems. And then the last one is hard to get at. Does it require innovation? Are we asking the students to do things that have already been done a million times, or are we asking the students to take a real-world problem and to apply what they've learned, the content, in order to find an innovative solution for the problem? And that's when we get down to the 3 and 4 level here. But for our volcano activity, we're pretty clearly up here at 1. The next rubric has to do with ICT learning. This, in essence, is asking, are we using technology in the lesson? Now, I normally would advise you against using technology for technology's sake. That's not a good thing. We want to keep the focus on the learning. However, there's a school of thought that argues that the inclusion of technology is something that we need to have at least in some of our lesson in order to help students learn to use these tools for the life outside of school. And so the use of ICT is included in this particular rubric. So for our volcanoes activity, are students using ICT? Well, yeah, they're making PowerPoint slides, they're doing some internet research, that's great. Second diamond, is ICT supporting students' knowledge construction? Well, no, because the students aren't really constructing knowledge. If you recall, and if I pop back up in here to the second rubric we went through, the first question is, does this require knowledge construction? We decided no, it really doesn't. So it would be hard for technology then to facilitate that knowledge construction because they're not really doing it. And as you can see, as we move down through the diamonds here, is ICT required for constructing the knowledge, meaning could this be done without technology? And then our final diamond here, are students designing an ICT project? So if they are, that gets us down to the 5 range here. But again, that it depends on the lesson. Our last skill that we're going to assess in this rubric is skilled communication. Now this one looks a little different. It's a little more complicated, but it's once you get into it, it's really not that much to it. So skilled communication looks at whether or not the students are working on developing communication skills, which is a skill that again is we associate with these 21st century skills as something that students are going to need to be able to do in school and outside of school. And the first question asks whether or not the activity requires students to participate in extended or multimodal communication. Extended communication refers to something longer than a short response, something that's not just a sentence or two, a paragraph or two, but something that the students actually have to put a little thought into and actually have to develop. Multimodal refers to whether or not the communication exists in more than one form. So instead of text on a page, is it text plus some kind of image? Is it audio plus a visual element? Is it video? Does it exist in more than one mode of communication? If the answer is no, again, we're going to pop over here to a 1. If it's yes, though, we'll move down in here. And I would say yes, this definitely requires communication because the students are creating these PowerPoint slides that ostensibly will have some writing associated with them. That could be multimodal. So yeah, we're going to pop down into the second diamond. Now, the second diamond asks if students are required to provide supporting evidence. Now, this evidence and argument thing is kind of a tricky one at first because obviously not all writing is an argument. But the reason why this is on here is that evidence is necessary to support an argument. An argument without evidence is merely opinion, and opinion is sort of good to a certain extent, but in academic contexts we tend more towards privileging argument. So there needs to be evidence to support the argument, and this is all about applying knowledge. If you're asking a student to make an argument, which involves evidence, you're asking the student to apply what they've learned in order to accomplish a task. In the case of argument, it's persuading an audience. So that's why this asks if the work that students provide includes supporting evidence. Now, for our volcano example, it doesn't, because they're just reciting facts about volcanoes. So we're going to say no, but before we mark this down as a 2, we're going to ask ourselves this next question. Are students asked to communicate to a particular audience? For the volcano example, that answer is no as well. Note that PowerPoint never goes anywhere. The slides are created basically for the teacher. We assume that because the lesson plan doesn't say who the slides are intended for, and the slides only go to the teacher. So we have to assume that the teacher is the audience. But teachers aren't people. That's the reason why students freak out when they see us in the grocery store, because we're not supposed to exist outside of school. So when you talk about an audience, teachers don't count. What this refers to is a person or a group of people or some kind of body that exists outside of the classroom and for whom students need to think about as they craft their communication, because you don't talk to everybody in the same way. And having students think about their audience is a really important part of their development as communicators, as writers, as producers of videos, as producers of audio. Communication is a two-way street, and they cannot ignore that second part of communication, which is the audience. And again, teachers don't really count. So in this case, I would say no to that as well and label that a 2. If we had included an audience, then we could come down here for a 3. If we did have, now moving back, if we did say yes, we require communication, yes, the students have to provide supporting evidence, and we communicate to a particular audience, then that's all the way down here at a 4. But instead, we're going to keep it up here at a 2 range. So to recap, collaboration, we were down here at a 3. students were making substantive decisions. Oh, sorry, students had shared responsibility, but they were not making substantive decisions. So that's why we're at a 3 here. Not really constructing knowledge, so that's going to be a 1. Not really a long-term activity, so self-regulation is going to be a 1. There's no problem solving involved, so that's going to be a 1. There is some ICT learning happening, but since we're not really constructing knowledge, we're sort of maxed out here at 2. And communication-wise, we're going to be down here at 2 because we do require multimodal communication, but we're not having the students provide supporting evidence, nor are we having the students communicate to a particular audience. Now, how would you improve this lesson? There's a lot of different things you could do to make this more 21st century skill style lesson. Perhaps we could have this turn it into a peer teaching unit where the students are creating this, they're researching and developing knowledge about volcanoes in order to teach it to somebody else. Now, just playing this through, we could have the students create groups, but perhaps not assign them the prescriptive roles, which might force the students to make more substantive decisions as they analyze the audience and try to figure out what the best form of communication is. Right now we're just having them make PowerPoint slides, but perhaps as they analyze the audience, they decide that this room full of younger children they're teaching to don't want to watch PowerPoints. They would do better with animations or something like that. Some kind of substantive decision would help us on the collaboration score. Would we be able to have knowledge construction if the whole purpose is just to learn different parts of a volcano? Maybe, maybe not. If this volcano lesson was part of a larger unit about the impact of volcanoes on human economy, and this was just a first stage in a longer lesson that got at students applying what they've learned about volcanoes in order to understand how they can impact, the movement of people and goods internationally, then that could get us somewhere where the students are getting into applying knowledge. I don't know. Also, making this a peer teaching unit would perhaps help with the self-regulation because it would have to end up being a longer term activity. And again, students are making their best judgment about how they were going to teach this unit on volcanoes, which would require them to plan their own work and increase the amount of self-regulation that has to happen. There could be some problem solving involved with maybe not necessarily learning more about volcanoes, but certainly some problem solving involved with how to communicate that information the best way. There may be some more ICT that would happen. The students could even get all the way down here to the bottom if they've used different computer models of volcanoes and the way ash clouds can disrupt air travel or something. I don't know. That could get you down into those. There's different ways to do it. And then certainly if we're going to go with this peer teaching model, we're going to be communicating to a particular audience, and that's going to get us down to this 3 range here. Even more so if perhaps what they're presenting is not just parts of volcano, but maybe an argument about how volcanoes impact the economy. So that's an example of how to evaluate a lesson based on this particular rubric. It's not necessarily perfect. There's certainly some things that you might disagree with in the rubric, but it absolutely creates a good dialogue among, within your own internal dialogue, or if you're working with a group of people to assess the quality of your lessons. This will give you a sense, if you're evaluating quality, of how a lesson gets at these particular set of skills. And again, it bears repeating just to keep in mind that this is one particular set of skills, not the end-all be-all of whether it's a good lesson or a bad lesson. You could score pretty high on 21st century skills and still have it not be a very good lesson. You could have some good lessons that don't get at these things. Just think of it in terms of your entire work as an educator.